Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guests today are Brian Korte, FAIA Principal, and Camden Greenlee, AIA Associate from the San Antonio office of Clayton Korte, also with an office in Austin, Texas. Brian, a native Texan, leads the San Antonio office in the firm's residential, ranch, and vineyard-related projects, currently in California, Hawaii, and Texas. With a passion for authenticity, richness, and well-crafted materials, Brian's work champions the honesty of modernism with a commitment to practical yet artful solutions. Since 2017, the firm has been recognized with more than 50 AIA and Allied Awards for design excellence. Throughout his career, Brian's work has been recognized with national, state, and local AIA Design Awards and additional awards from related industries. In February 2020, Korte was elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, an honor awarded to only 3% of all AIA members that acknowledges personal achievements, architectural excellence, and those architects who have made a significant contribution to architecture and society on a national level. Cam, after receiving his master's degree in architecture at the University of Illinois in 2010, taught undergraduate design courses as an adjunct professor for 4 years at his alma mater. The experience honed his understanding of the value of teamwork and design dialogue. Following his teaching tenure, Cam made the trip south to work for another regional architecture firm before joining Clayton Korte in 2016. Cam leverages his passion for building performance and environmental stewardship to help lead the firm's environmental design process and graphic visualization standards. His current stable of projects include ranch houses and vineyard projects in Texas and California that embrace their connection to their environment. His interest in architecture stemmed from an appreciation for the subtleties of materials, light, and the procession of space. The project we will be talking about today is the Fulldraw Vineyard in Paso Robles, California. In 2015, Connor and Rebecca McMahon embarked on a journey to craft a winery complex that mirrored their personalities and their aspirations. Teaming up with Clayton Korte, renowned for their winery design, they envisioned a space that exuded both familiarity and exclusivity, comfort and sophistication. The 12,620 square foot winery complex consists of 3 buildings: a 6,972 square foot fermentation and barrel aging building, and a 2,170 square foot case goods storage area, plus a second phase hospitality building that should be complete by 2026. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today, I'm super excited about, Brian Korte, FAIA Principal, and Camden Greenlee, AIA Associate from the San Antonio office of Clayton Korte, also with an office in Austin, Texas. But they are hailing today from San Antonio. The project we are going to chat about today is the Fulldraw Vineyard in, I had to look this up 3 times to say it right, Paso Robles, California. Brian and Cam, welcome to Detailed. Thank you for joining me today. How's it going?
Great. Doing well. Thanks for having us. We're super excited to be with you today.
Nice weather there?
Oh, beautiful. It's beautiful today. We get like 5 days a year where it's not 100 degrees. So.
Oh, I'm not sorry. I'm not feeling sorry for you. Not even a little bit. I come from a place where it rains for 6 months of the year and it's gloomy. So we actually have sunshine today and I'm dying to get outside. So we typically start off our episodes with some kind of icebreaker question, and that just depends on my mood that day when I wrote the script on what your icebreaker question is going to be. But I don't know why I chose this one for you, but I'm a student of human behavior. I'm a people watcher. I have friends that call me an empath. I like to ask people questions to try to figure out who they are, because I think certain questions tell you a lot about a person. So I'm going to ask you guys a question I ask a lot of people I meet for the first time, and that is, and in light of this news of this Oregonian winning this massive lottery, clearly that Oregonian was not me.
Yeah.
If you won the lottery, what is the very first thing you would buy, or the very first thing you would spend your money on?
Wow. That would be a fun and challenging decision. Mainly because I've been thinking about it a lot. I'd probably just focus on a very extended trip, maybe to Europe, and drag family and friends along for the ride, and have a really fun dinner.
Yeah, I assume a nice dinner probably isn't. It's what's after that that's important.
Yeah.
I'd probably start looking for property. I don't know where, but that would be the first thing in my mind.
Interesting. I won't tell you what that tells me. No, I'm kidding. No, they're great answers. My people ask me that question, and I don't know, maybe it's a point I've reached in my life, and none of us really know what we would do if we actually had that ridiculous amount of money. But
yeah,
the first thing I would do is go make sure every single person I love was taken care of. Whether it's paying off somebody's house, or my best friend's got a kid in college right now, paying for his college, or putting my mom in a nice place a little bit further away from me, something like that. But yeah, I love how people answer that question, because I get the craziest range of answers, just craziest range of answers. So let's talk about this project. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's one of those yellow pad moments where you just start jotting down all the things that you haven't really thought about, and then figure out what lands on top.
Well, the first thing after everybody got covered is me and my 5 girlfriends that I grew up with, that we're all still friends, we all still live local, are going on one hell of a girls' 2 weeks in Italy.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to say that. That would not be good for the podcast. Never mind. Let's talk about this project. So this is quite the facility. Let's start with a little bit of background or history on this project. What were the owners' goals? What made them want to build these buildings? Did they already have a vineyard?
Yeah. So I met Connor McMahon in sometime around in 2016, and I had just finished a project called Epic Winery, which is in Templeton, which is kind of 5 minutes from Paso Robles and closer to the coast. And Connor happened to be walking around the winery when I was there, kind of doing some, really post kind of punch list work. And he bumped into the owner's rep and was talking to him about the facility. And I think they had maybe met kind of in passing once, and he knew what Connor was up to. And as they were talking, I saw them point to me at the other end of the room, and he goes, "Well, there's the architect right there." And so Connor walked up to me and said, "Hey, I'm Connor, and I'm looking to do my own winery over in Paso. Why don't you give me a tour?" So I had a really opportune time to show him around Epic and everything that we had done there, and how they were making wine. And we had kind of just kind of hit it off. And then when Cam and I got involved with he and his wife, Rebecca, there was a real synergy there that we were able to build on, and started talking to them about the goals for their project and the process that we like to go through so that it's fun for them. And, it's a lot like designing a house, really, for them. It would, you get into the same types of questions. It's just kind of a different level of priorities. But so that's kind of what led to us. Connor was working as a associate winemaker at a really well-known winery that's right next door called Booker Vineyard, and had purchased this property that's kind of access between Booker Vineyard and Catapult Vineyard, which is coincidentally owned by Epic. And you drive down a long driveway through both of their vineyards to get to his, and then it just kind of opens up to these big kind of rolling vineyard vistas, which are really pretty. So, from there, we jumped in, and, we're now kind of have already completed first phase, or we're permitted for second phase, and the third phase is their home, which we're meeting with them about next week to try to help them with that. So,
what a great way to get a project.
It was lucky, yeah.
Just go hang out at a winery. I mean, I know you were working, but go hang out at a winery and I've got a new client.
Yeah.
But, that community is also, it's one of those, it's a small world.
And that's, a lot of it has happened that way through previous projects. Other vendors and winemakers see it, and, they have ambitions themselves.
Well, that's also a very discerning group. So that says a lot for you and your firm and the work that you do. Because as well as I do, if they see something they don't like, they're going to tear that apart. They're the masters of their craft. So if they like what they see, then you're getting it right. So that's pretty cool. What was the design vision that you were trying to achieve on this project?
From the outset, Connor was all about function over form. And, our goals were to, we always try to have a building that's kind of suited to its environment. And, in this case, we wanted that to fit comfortably in this kind of vineyard setting, but also provide a little bit of a contrast. The other thing was to create flexibility for he and his team to experiment and kind of hone their craft, if you will, towards making these incredible kind of Rhone-style wines that they're known for. And to the third goal was to kind of really create a destination. They wanted to be known as one of the go-to wineries and tasting rooms once that portion of the project gets fulfilled in the area. And I think they've kind of done incredible since they've started this.
Well, it's important to mention that they live on the property that the winery is and all the vineyards. So I think they really see themselves as shepherds of the property and constantly working towards developing. I mean, they're fairly young. They're in their mid-30s. So very young, a couple who are setting out on this. And even though their ambitions at the beginning were to just a utility, I want to be able to make a specific type of wine the way I want to make it. The question of beauty it's for us, it's never, all right, well, if they just want a warehouse, let's give them a warehouse. No, that's not how we're going to work. And we conveyed that fairly early on, and I think Connor and Becca got behind it as well and gave us a lot of trust. Which is really important. I can't stress enough about the relationship between you and your client, because they're trusting us to see something that they don't, and within the limits of what they can and cannot do.
Well, I've also found, I don't know, maybe we'll call this alcohol month on the podcast, but just as I mentioned to you before, just released an episode today on another interview in a winery, and I did one, I don't know if I should say this. Is that one out yet? I don't think it's out yet. Another one on a distillery. And that function over form is prevalent, but I'm hearing all these really unique ways that people are making things beautiful while still honoring that. Mm-hmm. There are ways to take some pretty average materials and how you use them and make them really shine. So I'm interested to talk about that because we'll be talking about that in a minute. So let's get into some specifics. And I figured we'll just go from the outside in, starting with the site. So the first thing, all kinds of crazy things pop in my head, but the first thing I thought as I was looking at the pictures was, that looks like it's in the middle of nowhere from the pictures. It looks like there's nothing around for a really long way. Were there challenges on this site for where you were going to put the buildings? And I'm dying to know how you got utilities there.
Well, like I mentioned before, this property is kind of cool in the fact that you approach it through 2 other vineyards that are really pretty. And so once you get in there, it kind of opens up. It's, 50 acres or so of planted vines. And the site where the buildings are located was long before we saw the property. It used to have an old house on it and a garage and things like that. So, but it was on the top of this little knoll that, had a sense of prospect from where it was located. So it was kind of ideally situated for a winery and a future tasting room to look out kind of over the vineyard that was going to be there. He started planting vines, very early. They take several years to mature. I think before that, when we first went to the property, there was still a really big male bull on the property. And previously this was a cattle ranch before grapes were planted. Some of the remnants of that pasture fencing is still there until phase 2 comes online, and they can kind of spend a little money to remove some of that stuff and do a lot of the landscaping that we had looked at. But so utilities were there. So we had water and we had power to this particular part of the property.
The remoteness may look a little deceiving because you're right in the middle of wine country in Paso Robles. So it's very agrarian, but it's also pretty well developed.
Yeah, I've heard certainly didn't get that vibe.
Yeah, well, if you look at it from an aerial view, the things are fairly spread out. But there are over 300 wineries in this part of California, so it's kind of rivaling kind of Napa to a certain degree, which is great for them.
Well, I didn't know that. You should not have told me that. I did not need to know that. Napa is one of the places, of many places I want to go that I have not visited. And now that I know this, I'm going to have to add another place to my list.
Yeah, you got to go to Paso first.
Yeah, they're both very different and both are very cool. So I think, seeing both of them, they're 4 hours apart. So give yourself time. Yeah, you could
do all the things. What are some of the outdoor features that are a part of your design that were not there before that you have incorporated into this project or are going to with this new phase as well?
Well, as Brian described, it was on this knoll that was previously developed with a house and garage and barn. And so it has a bit of an open area to it that we developed the winery. And the goal was to use the massings of the building to kind of sculpt a new little area that we can build off of in phase 2 that we'll talk about. As far as the outside, everything centralizes around an exterior crush pad. And crush pad, for those who aren't familiar with winemaking processes, where they bring all the grapes and they literally crush them to extract the juice, and then it goes in the fermentation tanks. And the process was, knowing and understanding that process is really important because you can visualize it in the architecture. And we centralize everything around the crush pad, so that's where it starts. It goes in the fermentation tanks where it ferments. It gets barreled and staged on the crush pads back again, and then placed in the barrel storage for it to age before it's bottled. And so that crush pad is a nexus for everything else. Additionally, with that property is it's in this what's called the Templeton Gap, which is this gap through the mountains where winds just come hauling through most of the year. And so the large fermentation building on the west helps shelter that crush pad and protect people from those pretty severe winds. So that being said, the buildings also has to be very resilient. So all the materials we chose were about low maintenance. We're not trying to lie about anything. We want authentic materials. So what you see is what you get. The structural steel is primed and painted. We have some metals that are allowed to rust and patina over time. And then we use this Kingspan insulated metal panel around the building to sheet it and close it. Also knowing that the buildings around the central crush pad, daylight's really important in some of these facilities. So the clear story windows that wrap around the fermentation space were all done so that you could get even distribution of light anywhere in the facility. And then if it were to be subdivided down the road, if they were to change the way they operate, it wouldn't affect the lighting, the daylight in the project.
Nice. Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with the crush pad because I compete in a grape stomping competition
Yeah.
at one of the vineyards here in town, and part of the competition is wearing costumes. And I've done it a couple different times with a friend, a different friend each time. But yeah, so I've had my own little party with the crush pad in my feet. It does not leave your feet in very nice condition, though. They're very red.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the building exterior. You just started alluding to that. Tell me about the exterior design, some of the materials you used, and what's unique about it.
Well, the fermentation building, going back to kind of what Cam was talking about, is the kind of the cornerstone of the project. It's this big, open, light-filled space that is all about flexibility and uncomplicated flow and simplicity. I mean, we try to set these things up for the client to have room to change their mind down the line, because they truly are experimenting with every vintage. And if they're always have everything so prescribed at the beginning, then there's no room for kind of expanding their craft. So that building is unconditioned. There's a couple of small offices at one end, so 5% of it has air conditioning when they need it, but it's unconditioned space. They're big ass fans that move low velocity, move the air around. We have some operable polycarbonate kind of pivoting windows on the west side that help to flush the building with cold air at night. So all of that kind of function, combined with this kind of daylight, allows them to never have to turn the lights on, for one, which is really great because you're working in a really nice, balanced, lit environment, which just feels better than being inside of even if they're really great LEDs, they're still lights. So this kind of open, passive, ventilated space is really the backbone of the project. That then this giant covered porch crush pad connects to the case goods and kind of barrel storage building, which is a chilled environment. So that structure of the winery is a steel framed, pre-engineered metal building system that is skinned with an insulated metal panel all the way around, so that creates that envelope. But the materials on the outside are what you get on the inside. So wherever we have a insulated metal panel on the outside, it's doing double duty. We have some burnished concrete block that's exposed to the outside. It's also on the inside. Fiber cement panels. All of this stuff is able to get wet, and that happens all the time. The floors are always wet. The walls get wet. You need something you're not going to be worried about. Hoses are everywhere. It's a rubber boot environment. So, but they're resilient. They dry, and they still look like they did. So, that's kind of the main move of the material palette on this particular part of the project.
What'd you do for the roof? I don't remember.
The roof is the same as the walls. It's a metal insulated panel. On the fermentation space, which is not conditioned, it's just 2 inches. Really, it's just there to shed water and keep the sun out of the space. But in the barrel storage room where we have for chilling to 55 degrees, it's 6 inches of foam insulation that's clad on both sides of the metal.
And the only difference between the wall panels and other than thickness and the roof panels is color. The walls are all, on the outside are all this really dark custom color. On the inside, they're an off-white to reflect as much light as we can get. And on the roof, they're white to reflect as much sunlight. And each roof is planned to have a PV system that hopefully will get installed in the second phase too, to help generate on-site power.
What kinds of things do you have to think about for a winery that you don't have to in your typical day-to-day life as an architect?
Well, the scale is important here. We've been fortunate to tour through some breweries too, and they have these, giant vats. Winemaking is a little, at least at the scales that we work in, the winemaking is a much smaller operation. We still have fermentation tanks and there's all the infrastructure that goes into servicing those, but they're much smaller scale and more numerous. It might be a consequence of just the way the winemakers that we work with, the way they want to work. But with Fulldraw, we were pretty fortunate. Connor, the owner, knew right off the bat what kind of fermentation tanks he wanted to use. And that's usually one of the big key things we need to understand as we're designing. And so it allowed us to know exactly what scale the tanks were going to be and what they looked like. They're beautifully crafted stainless steel. We marched those just in a little row all the way down the length of the fermentation space, like little statues to winemaking. But knowing ahead of time the dimensions of those tanks allowed us to coordinate all the catwalks and access to the tanks and have how high they're going to be, lifted and clearances and all that jazz. What can be easily forgotten is the infrastructure that supports all of those tanks, that supports all the things that are visible. There's just a glycol, hot and cold water, electricity, nitrogen, pressurized air, all sorts of things. And we have, and we still do, rely on really good consultants for that work, people who are embedded in that world as a profession. Hopefully we're humble enough to know that we don't know exactly how everything fits, gets put together. But the key for an architect is to ask the right questions. You need to know enough about what it is that you're doing so that you can ask the consultants the kinds of questions that tell us where these things go, how big they are, what they look like, how they need to be directed and connected to all the different pieces of infrastructure. And that's something you learn over time. Brian's been at it a little longer than I have, but that's pretty key. And if you can wrap your head around that, we look at it as an opportunity. We don't really shy away from, all right, put all the tanks over there, but the buildings over here. The buildings and the tanks, all of that infrastructure, the way that they move around the space, the materials that we talked about earlier, those are all part of the toolkit that we have to say, here's how we're going to sculpt this so that the process of making wine is front and center. And over time, too, you learn how to make wine, more or less. You learn the process. Yeah.
You learn more about how to drink it.
Yeah. All the winemakers who might be listening to this are going to be scoffing at this. Yeah. But it's, it's about knowing a little bit about what Connor and Becca do in their lives. And if you can do that, if you can empathize with them, if you can start to understand what they want out of the process, then you it makes it a lot easier to design something meaningful. And so the poetry is our job. It's our job to pull the poetry out of the process and pull the poetry out of the space, and not be, okay, here's your tanks. It's more than that.
Well, personally, I think those tanks are rather impactful. And in a space that's designed right, I think that they can be very beautiful. Um, and they can be a piece that adds this depth and richness to the space, or it can look like some warehouse processing, because I've seen it both ways.
Well, there's a side story to this. We were just in California, in Sacramento, I don't know, a couple months ago at Winemaker Expo.
The wine and grape symposium they have every year.
And we walked by the booth of the company that makes these particular Lagarde, who makes they're French Canadian, who make these tanks, and you start to talk to them. They have the same level of craftsmanship and care and thought that goes into their tanks as we hope to have in our projects. And so when you recognize that, you can actually expose the craftsmanship of the tank, and it becomes part of the design, part of the work.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there is kind of everything Cam just said. There's also we try to, we don't want to hide all of this kind of infrastructure, but we do try our best to curate kind of these ribbons of piping that, sometimes you don't expect how much there is. You can read it on a mechanical engineer, plumbing engineer's drawings, and you get through it with them, and they're not really thinking the way you are. They're just like, I just need to get from A to B. I got to have these many valves. I got to have this and that, and I got to make it work. And we're like, well, we're trying to make it also look very organized, but expressive. And so all of that stuff is kind of what makes these spaces. If you took the fermentation space at Fulldraw and you stripped it out of all of the wine-related equipment or barrels, it would be very sterile. But I think the minute all of that is kind of expressed in there and animates the space, those stainless tanks pick up the light from every direction of the room. They keep them very clean. They're not necessarily polished, but they're very focal, and they're pretty much the star of the show in that building. So they ought to be cool. And these happen to be all stainless. On the Epic project, for example, there's a combination of stainless, conical shaped concrete, wood, terracotta. I mean, you name it, and it's all, again, that's just their form of experimentation with different materials to get a different yield and a flavor profile that they're after.
You said it, even having worked in MEP for a while, you said something that I never really thought about. I've obviously, having done that, the miles and miles of pipe or wiring or whatever that have to happen in facilities like this. And you're right, they don't typically think about how pretty is this going to look when I'm done. It's just like, how do I get it all hooked up and running the way it's supposed to run? And so I think that's really good advice for maybe some of our younger architectural professionals that listen to this podcast. Is you have to think beyond that piece of equipment, and do that communication and coordination with your MEP consultants to make sure, because those things can make it very ugly, or it can make it look really cool. And there's usually not a whole lot of in between. It's going to be either one or the other. So I love that you said that. Tell me about the case goods storage facility. What's going on there?
So the case goods, which is also the barrel aging, it's a refrigerated building. It's pretty simple in its form. It's quite literally a rectilinear box that's clad with 6 inches of Kingspan metal insulated panels, and it's inside. It's a very utilitarian space. It's meant to be completely open so that as Connor and Becca's process may change in the future or their quantities, they can shift and move things around as much as they want. From an architectural standpoint, it's kind of a bodyguard of sorts to the crush pad, and because it stands in between what's going to be the phase 2 tasting room hopefully in the next couple of years, and the crush pad. And crush pads, again, they're pretty wild spaces, particularly at harvest time. They just get crazy. Lots of noise, lots of staining, lots of all sorts of stuff going on. And so the fermentation building is positioned right in between for two reasons. One is to protect future tasting room from that chaos. And two, it's to give the tasting room a backdrop of what people are really there to experience, which is the wine. And so we designed a little opening, glazed opening within that envelope that's going to align perfectly with the entrance of the tasting room in the future. So as you're approaching, you approach in between the barrel storage and the tasting room. To your left will be, this window wall with all of these barrels stacked up against it, so you can see here's where the wine's being stored. And then to the right would be the entrance of the tasting room. And so it's a little sentry building, has kind of a large role, but it's relatively simple in its structure.
And just like the fermentation building, it has two openings that bring daylight in. One is a channel glass kind of wall on the east side that gets morning light in, and then, as Cam was saying, the windows that are kind of accentuating the barrels to the future tasting room patrons is bringing in a bunch of diffused north light. So again, the idea is that the lights really don't ever come on unless they're working up there at night.
So you said something, and I have not worked on a project like that before, so I'm going to ask this question, even if it sounds like a stupid question. How do you refrigerate a building? What do you have to do to make it a refrigerated building?
Yeah, the term refrigeration just hits a specific temperature point, but in this case, it's just really intense air conditioning. And the way it's done at the scale of what we're talking about here, there's a chiller plant, a glycol chiller plant in the mechanical yard, which is on the opposite side of the crush pad as the barrel storage building. And that produces all of this very cold glycol, which is then pumped underground into the barrel room. And then there's a series of fan coils. I think there's 2 fan coils that basically circulate air inside the barrel room and pass it over the really chilled coils. And that keeps it 55.
I learned something new today.
Yeah.
You said
it's really important too that there's 6 inches of uninterrupted insulation around the building. It's continuous. And the reason for that is because there can be big temperature deltas. We're getting into the science of it.
No, that's what she asked.
Yeah. It might get a little nerdy here, but big temperature, it can be 110 degrees in Paso Robles at the hotter times of the year. And so there can be a really significant temperature difference. And so the more insulation we have, the lower amounts of energy that need to be used to keep that nice and consistent.
And that's, a strategy for an above ground refrigerated space. On some of our other projects, the barrel storage is underground in a cave. And so you get the kind of benefit of 80 feet of soil above that's kind of helping you provide that insulated buffer and trying to keep the just using natural ventilation to try to keep it in that below 60 temperature range. So there's several ways you can do it.
That's kind of what I've seen on other projects is it they did it underground.
Okay.
Interesting. And don't worry about, I have a t-shirt that says talk nerdy to me. Do not worry about getting technical. I really, truly do. I bought that one in Boston at MIT. So you guys have a second phase hospitality building coming on this project. So where are you in that process, and what is it because this is kind of the big deal. They're all a big deal. You got to have the wine or nobody wants to come to the hospitality place. But, I know I've been to a lot of wineries, and having that beautiful place to hang out, look over the vineyards. There's just nothing quite like that. So what are you planning for the hospitality? And don't worry, nobody will hold you to it if you're still designing pieces and parts.
No.
But
We are very excited because 3 weeks ago, I think we finally got our permits approved. So it's now kind of up to Connor and Becca on when they'd like to start construction. We're hoping it's kind of sometime towards the end of the year, but there's some factors at play there. But the winery as kind of the interim hospitality and everything facility for them. Occasionally they do curated tastings in that space, which is kind of neat from a contrast because the visitors get to be in the belly of the working winery. It's kind of this machine that they're immersed in, and you're getting you're tasting wines while you're looking out to the north to the vineyard. You're getting the sense of smell from the fermentation process, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And tasting these incredible wines. And the tasting room, as Cam lined up, is kind of the next phase that's hanging off of this edge of the knoll that we've kind of reserved that spot for the visitors to have a great view of the vineyard and to take advantage of all of this temperate kind of northern light that'll fill up the interior. And it's a counterpart. It's a lot less utilitarian. It's made for human habitation, touch. Everything's warmer. You're meant to be there. And
if the winery is kind of the dirty, messy process of making wine, the tasting room is the really refined part of drinking it. And it's totally different scale, but there's a lot of, we've built in a lot of correlations with materials or using materials from the winery on the tasting room so that there's kind of a big brother, little brother type thing. And so that they speak to each other. And I think it's props to the owner as well that the vision they had was far-reaching, and they brought us in as part of that far-reaching vision. It wasn't, okay, I'm going to hire you to do a winery, and then in secret, I'm going to hire you later or hire someone else later to do a tasting room. They've really had a very long-term vision that we've gotten to be a part of, and that has allowed us to have all of these, layered correlations between the winery as a winemaking place and the tasting room or the hospitality building as a wine tasting venue.
And so in the hospitality building, is it, how big is it?
Just under 4,000 square feet.
So is it mainly strictly a tasting room? There's no restaurant or any outdoor space associated with that you can sit? I love to sit out.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Its size is kind of split between indoor kind of main kind of lounge space, kind of VIP room that's surrounded by a chilled kind of wine library, and then terraces outdoors that some are covered, some aren't. All of them are kind of planned to allow you to be outside at all times of the day and year by having, a certain amount of screening to help knock down winds that are always going to hit you from a certain direction at the exact time of day. And, a little bit of admin space that they need to run the business. So
it sounds, I think I'm going to have to go down there. I will be in California in August. I don't think you're going to have it built yet, though.
No.
Was there anything in this project that was particularly difficult to detail or make come together in the design? And if so, what did you learn from it?
There are plenty of challenges. I think, as everyone probably answers that question, there's plenty of challenges. Of particular detail, it's a pre-engineered metal building, and so there's a whole lot of standardization that goes into pre-engineered metal buildings that just sits under the surface, kind of guised as customization, but it's really not. And there's a lot of not necessarily unwritten rules, but there's many assumptions that go into how pre-engineered metal buildings go together that as an architect you may not be aware of the first time you do one. And so some of the challenges we had to deal with were, things showing up as part of the pre-engineered metal building structure that were not as we anticipated them to be. And that process was a little opaque for our taste, and it led to some things, but you work around it. You had to change some framing. We had to realign some finishes. And ultimately it's the engineered metal building doesn't change. You can't do much with it. So you have to do what you can around it. Other things were, we were using some materials like fiber cement panels, and how, they come in large sheets, 4x8 sheets, or even larger sometimes. And so trying to figure out how do we fabricate those in a way where we can control the seams and we can control the alignments, particularly related to a pre-engineered metal building. And so we decided to use fairly narrow, 12-inch strips of vertical fiber cement. One, because we built on the rhythm of the Kingspan panels on the exterior. But two, it gave us the flexibility to kind of get our details the way we wanted to.
Oh, that's good advice. I don't know that I would have thought of that.
Well, it's similar to things like, tumbling groove, wood, planks. Sometimes we'll do, if we don't know that we can control all of the dimensions, if there's something existing that we have to work around, or if we're doing board-formed concrete, sometimes we'll specify random widths of wood so that we can guarantee that the seams at the top and the bottom, or the left sides, left and right, can line up with important elements in the architecture. If you say, well, no, they have to be 3.5 inches wide, all of them, then you better be sure that when it goes to construction time, you can really control the spacing and lengths of those boards.
One other thing that comes to mind that is less about detailing is more about installation. We have most all of our windows and doors are from Dynamic Fenestration Illuminart series, which is a really beautiful product. And they provide top-notch design consultation, technical advice, shop drawings, everything you need to get that product to the site. But installation, we spent a lot of energy trying to help the contractor find someone who would install them. Everybody was nervous because, we're in Central California and these units are being shipped from Canada. They must be fancy. They're going to be hard to work with. And so, I remember that being a really difficult problem to work through. And we were making phone calls to other contractor contacts that we had in Seattle and LA, and trying to get people that would come up from those cities or from San Francisco. And finally, one of the local glazing contractors agreed that it wasn't as difficult as they thought in the beginning. And so once they finally got their head into it, they realized, these are just doors. It's not a big deal, and everything went fine. But being remote, you brought that up earlier, there are some factors that do come into play that are real things to think about. And a couple we hadn't really even thought of until after the project was done. One of the doors had a problem, not dynamic, but one of the overhead doors. And the only people that could service it were 4 hours away. And so it's not a quick thing, when you want to get a ranger to come repair the door or, replace a motor or something like that. So something to think about is just serviceability that goes into everything that we specify. And, that was a situation where we had no idea that was going to be an issue, but now we know. So as we move into all these other facilities, we have kind of head view looking at things like that. And we know not to worry about certain things and to think harder on others. So
I would imagine skilled labor, just having, you're in a big city, you've got lots and lots and lots of choices. But you get out remote, and having skilled labor in all the areas you need them is probably a little more challenging as well, just for standard construction.
That's an understatement. I mean, we have lots of remote projects in Texas and California, and it is it's a constant concern.
You triggered one other. I'm going down another rabbit hole. You started talking about the doors, and I started thinking, how do you install a door in a pre-manufactured building as compared to how you install doors? I mean, normal.
Yeah, it's a good question, and and this goes to the point I made earlier, which is you have to build details around pre-engineered metal building. It's not the other way. So, almost all of the doors, I might be able to say all of the doors and windows that engage with the metal building, they're really pulled off of the main structure using metal framing. So we use light gauge metal framing to make those kinds of connections that we need, so that we don't engage the metal building. And one of the things that comes up structurally for those is metal buildings have a tendency to move differently than a different, typical structural steel building. They have different tolerances. They have different, they don't have different seismic conditions, but they have different seismic responses. And I remember there are a lot of conversations with our structural engineer who is doing the not metal building part, and how we were going to engage with that became really important. And the biggest thing overall was just the movement, making sure you have enough fluff between really sensitive assemblies like windows and doors and the metal building itself. It was a huge issue.
Interesting. I just started thinking, it's like, wait, how do you put it? I've never worked on a pre-manufactured building either. So I'm like, how do you get a door in there? I work for a building enclosure consultant now. So everything's all about getting everything as tight as you can get it.
Yeah.
And all I could think is, how do you do that in a manufactured metal building and get those windows and doors tight? But I would guess, at least in the main room, the first one, they don't need to have it all that tight.
Yeah. Even when you do, I think you have to think of a pre-engineered metal building as a skeleton that is skinned on the outside. So if we think of a traditionally framed building, we think of skeleton and skin as in the same layer. In a pre-engineered metal building, the steel structures on the inside and it's clad on the outside. It's the same thing with fermentation building and the barrel storage here. So your envelope is actually outboard of the structure, the main structure itself, and that's the portion that you engage with most of the time.
That makes sense. Let's talk about construction, since we started touching on that. You already talked a little bit about, challenge of getting people out there. What were some of the challenges, or were there any challenges or unexpected conditions that you encountered once actual construction started, and how did you work it out? Or did you have to pivot on something that you originally designed because of something that happened during construction?
Well, for a while, it seemed like we were pivoting a lot, and which was frustrating, but also kind of a challenge to figure out how to come in and make something work with what we thought was a problem. So there were a couple of examples. Cam brought up the metal building system being different than what we had all reviewed in shop drawings, and after fabrication they just kind of did what they wanted and it just showed up, and by the time it shows up you're not changing anything. And so there are a lot of conditions that you can draw as many of them as you want in shop drawings and review those details and get it exactly. Everybody's going back 5 times back and forth, marking them up. And then something will show up and have these giant plate connections that weren't shown in the shop drawings that suddenly your finishes have to work around, that were supposed to touch up just a smooth flange, and all of a sudden there's this big bump out that you have to address.
And these are those assumptions that I was talking about. I think as architects, when we look at something, we try and see whether it's a drawing. If it's a drawing, we are assuming, much to our chagrin on this project, that the drawing is showing you exactly what's going to show up. So very visual. That this is to scale. We love it when it's to scale and when it shows real thicknesses. And in this situation, the way the drawings were created by the metal building engineer were not that. And so it's like looking at something in a different language. You're trying to read it, and you don't quite know what it means. And the communication between the engineer for the metal building and ourselves was disconnected. We never had direct contact. So it led to a situation where we thought we had reviewed and coordinated the metal building, and then down the line we found out that it was changed again in our absence, and fabrication had already started, and so it was just this kind of emergency switch. Okay, now we have to bend to this. In the end, you look back, it's like, oh, it wasn't a huge deal, but at the moment it felt pretty serious.
Yeah. All of those little moments, are probably things that we see, but nobody else pays attention to. So we understand that, and that, pick and choose our battles with. And, the contractor was great about trying to help with those types of things too. They understood that, all of those details matter, not only to us, but to the owner. And so, there's a certain limit to what you can do without completely pulling something out and starting over. But I think we made the most of every one of those opportunities to clean it up.
Well, I mean, and that's great. And I imagine, things feel catastrophic in the moment, especially if there's a lot of changes. But in a different circumstance, in a different design or plan, something like that could be catastrophic. And so just knowing that, hey, if you're working on anything with a pre-manufactured building, metal building, that you might have some extra T's you need to cross and I's you need to dot, and send me pictures of it.
Yeah.
I want to see the real deal.
It's the same with the infrastructure conversation we were having with earlier, which is knowing what kinds of questions to ask that, get you down to demanding people answer exactly what's going to happen. And the shop drawing process is really the time to do that.
We also tend to try to get people like fire suppression installers to thread needles that they otherwise don't typically have to do. And so, there's a lot of head scratching, and sometimes, they're on board and they really take extra effort to get something to really snake through somewhere where it's going to be concealed. And other times they win and it's hanging in a spot where you didn't really want it. But at the end of the day, this type of building, that, like I said earlier, that exposure of all this piping and stuff, it just kind of adds to the narrative, and it's fine, so.
You don't really have a lot of opportunities unless you're actually sheetrocking walls inside to have anywhere to hide anything.
Yep.
Yeah, it's in the winery, everything's pretty exposed.
So those conversations are even more important because you can't hide it from everybody if it doesn't come out. Was there any, and I'm asking this question, another rabbit hole question, we'll just call it the rabbit hole interview. Was there any issues at all with permitting this project? And I asked that because in a past interview, there were some challenges with getting the permit. That particular building department really didn't know what to do with this kind of building. How'd the permitting process go?
Well, so
that is a rabbit hole.
Yeah, this is a rabbit. We'll try and keep this as short as we can. If you've been to this part of California and had to work in this environment, I think you'd know how deep this hole goes, but the type of building is not necessarily an issue with permitting because it's very common. I think we were just talking about this several months ago with another winemaker that, in the 80s, there were 6 wineries in Paso Robles, and now there's over 300. So they're very familiar with this type of project. The challenge is navigating pretty extensive set of rules and requirements that in many cases are super beneficial. They help standardize and they help make projects better. It's the implementation, it's the review and implementation and communication part that is quite difficult. And it's actually so difficult that it's common to have a consultant who is on every one of our projects in this part of California who is there solely to help us navigate the permitting process. So we'd like to say that we've gotten better at it.
Well, it is,
and new challenges arrive
every one of them seems different. I wish that we could have a set of rules from the jurisdiction and say, this is what you have to do on each one of these. But it depends on who you get as the plan reviewer. And they have their own process and their own way of how they want information. And you then are having to change how you issue drawings and how you label drawings and what's in a set and what's not. And it just is cumbersome. But, as I recall, this was permitted back in 2016. I don't think we had maybe 4 reviews on this project, and it got so granular that we had to go to the head of the building department and say, this is ridiculous. Because they actually had farmed it out to a third-party reviewer, and I think they get paid per review or something. But it just kept coming. They just kept coming up with new questions, and we're like, you have to stop at some point. We've answered everything that you want. We don't need to show you the screw pattern on something that is per manufacturer's installation instructions. It was getting to that level of kind of ridiculousness. But on other projects, we've had them run way longer. We have a project that also recently just got its grading and building permit, but it was in for 2 years. 2 years sitting in their hands in permitting review. And it's tough on clients. I mean, a lot happened in 2 years. We had this one in before, I think, right around the time of COVID. And, a lot changed in the construction world and the cost of financing world in that time frame. So they're coming and now have a permit at a time when you can't get your money very easily. And so it created a whole new set of problems, and that's a whole different rabbit hole. But, yeah.
Yeah, I asked that question on purpose specifically because this project was in California, and my running joke is working in California is like working on Mars. Yeah. I sometimes would say that if we have offices all over, we work in all. I'm the only spec writer for all 10 of our offices all over, so I do projects all over. The only place I tense up a little bit is when I hear it's a California project.
Yeah.
I really tense up if I hear it's a public project.
Oh, I can imagine. Can't imagine.
Yeah, I have an architect friend that down in California that had to wait 1.5 years for a permit for an ADU.
Yeah.
That can actually be hurtful to people. Like you said, the economy went crazy after COVID hit, and all kinds of crazy things were happening. Things were skyrocketing and dropping, and contractors were hoarding materials, and you couldn't find materials you needed. How do you plan? If I was a business owner, if I was going to go build a winery, how do I financially plan for a facility when I have no idea how long it's going to take to get a permit?
Yeah.
So hoping someday they'll improve that because I don't think it's doing anybody any good.
Well, it's an incredible contrast to some of our other projects, mostly here in Texas. We have a lot of ranch projects that we do and the difference of going through an arduous permitting process in California versus sending a set of documents here in Texas to the contractor, and the only thing he has to do is write a check for the septic permit. There's no plan review. There's no, you just start building, and it's kind of great, but
yeah, I mean, we have to specify that it's the intentions are sound, and we aren't advocating. We would never advocate for a process where substandard work or gets approved or gets through and built. We have high standards ourselves, which is why I think having a permitting process that in some cases undermines our own standards, right? The process itself can actually defeat its own intentions. That's where it gets really frustrating.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I know every state's different, and I know it's a lot easier in some states, but you are still feeling like that there's oversight and making sure that those substandard projects get through. I mean, everybody in Portland complains about how long it takes to get a permit or have to wait for their drawings. I'm like, you have no idea.
Yeah.
Oh, you had to wait 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and they're freaking out. It's like, just go do one project in California and you will be so happy here the rest of your life. I've always wished that we could just have one process for the whole country. You're going to have your regional and jurisdictional differences, your little addendums to that one process. But I think it would go a long way to getting work done more efficiently, because everybody loses. Well, when you end up in a situation that's prolonged like that.
Yeah, and it changes our business practice too. I mean, we've had to modify the way we write contracts for projects in California, specifically to protect ourselves against the permitting process. And it's a conversation we have with our clients very early on, and it's never. I mean, they've been generally accepting because I think they know the environment that they're in. But it's never a fun thing to have to tell somebody that just because of the location of the project, it's going to cost more and take longer.
Yeah, and not just in fees on your project. It's going to cost more. Anything's going to cost more if it takes longer in everything you're trying to plan.
Yep.
What about, speaking of California, this question is here largely because it's in California, sustainability goals on the project. I think California has more state-mandated sustainability requirements than probably any state in the country. But what did you do? And it doesn't, you don't necessarily have to be going after LEED, but what did you do to help make this project as sustainable as you could within the framework that you had to work within for these clients?
That's a good question. It's actually very similar to kind of a LEED process in the fact that the states kind of code mandate for Cal Green is what they call it, their green building ordinance. We have to meet certain mandatory measures and tiering for this type of facility. They have different levels, and each level has a different set of measures that you have to meet. And then you also have to meet their Title 24 for energy compliance. So with all of that, our project, we had a very manageable set of restrictions that we had to work within, and everything was based off of passive design principles to start off. So that the buildings, as we kind of mentioned earlier, were sited in a way where they were, oriented properly to take advantage of daylight and breezes and block winds and sun where you didn't want it. And then from there, we also have an unconditioned building, which is for the most part, pretty energy efficient. The fact that the lighting is all very energy efficient to begin with, but it rarely gets turned on. I mean, it's a low energy and intensive environment.
And where there is required energy, like in the refrigeration portion, you take different measures or different steps to ensure that you're optimizing or minimizing the amount of energy needed. So that 6 inches of foam that goes all the way around the building makes that like a little refrigerator. And, we have this might be more general statement. We have a philosophy on sustainability that I think points more towards resilience and value, and specific to each project and site. And we try and incorporate not a checklist that we can go down and say, okay, yes, we've done this, that, and the other. But we try and embed a philosophy from the beginning to the end about when you're making decisions regarding the way the building is sited and oriented, then you focus on these types of parameters. And as you go down, you keep layering on more nuance into the project to solve, issues of energy use, longevity, material sourcing. You put all that's part of the process. At the end, do we have a checklist of performance metrics and the like? Yeah, we do. But our goal isn't. We don't have this checklist as the goal in our minds. We use the checklist as a set of guidelines. And ideally, and in many cases, I think we exceed certain parts of the Cal Green requirements, Title 24 and the like. Not because it was a goal of ours, but because the process that led to that conclusion was the best. It had all of these things built into it.
Well, that's a really common sense. I'm not a big fan of some of the checklists.
Yeah.
Every building is like every child. No two are ever going to be the same. And then you add in every jurisdiction is different. Weather is different. There's so many different things at play that really looking at it more holistically and what can I do here?
Yeah.
Rather than trying to meet a checklist. I have to ask, though, because this is California, and a winery typically uses a lot of water. Did you have to do anything special with that?
Well, the main water use for wineries are the vineyards irrigation, which is really out of our scope of control. And I believe they have requirements for that. So, if you go into this part of California, you'll never see these sprinklers just shooting water all over the vines. They're always a drip system, which is about as efficient as you can be. And so they're very, very careful within our purview of what we are doing, specifying certain types of plumbing fixtures. We can't control the amount of hot water that the owner's going to use. They're going to use as much hot water as they need to sterilize their equipment. But for the most part, outside of the agricultural use, right, where the restrooms, the laboratory, the break room, those types of things, we're making as sensible choices as we can.
I'm speaking at the American Society of Irrigation Consultants conference next month. So I'm going to ask them, what's going on in California, people?
Is it in Phoenix?
No, because they do one of their biggest project types. This is the third time I've spoke at their national conference, and they do a lot of golf courses. But no, it's in Victoria, Canada.
Oh, wow.
At the Empress Hotel. And
Nice,
I'm so disappointed that I have to stay there for 4 days to speak for 1 hour. No, they're great people. But I'm going to ask some questions about some of that because I'm just curious, what they're seeing in California these days, because we do have an office in California as well. So every project includes lessons learned. I think we've already been very fortunate to touch on a number of them today. It's just the way this business works. You don't go through a project and not learn things. It doesn't mean that anybody screwed anything up. I'm learning something new every day. So I would like to ask each one of you what your biggest lesson learned was from this project that will change the way you do that thing on your next project to make the next one even better?
I'll let you go first.
Yeah. I guess, Brian and I are different stages of our professional career.
I'm a little younger.
Yeah.
Brian, as you can tell by the
beard. That's the gray gives it away. And so the lessons that I might learn are going to be a little different, but specifically with Fulldraw Winery, the biggest takeaway that I had was to, as much as possible, get ahead of assumptions and expectations and process. I think if you rely too much on the benefit of the doubt, you're opening yourself up to surprises. And to assume that everyone involved in the project has the same goals, values, or even vision as you is a mistake. And so getting ahead of problems, getting ahead of those misinterpretations or those misunderstandings is super important. Don't wait for a consultant to send you something. Get ahead of it and set expectations early. Say, you may on other projects have just routed the glycol lines wherever you want it or wherever most convenient. But here, our expectations are that those will be curated so that when they come out of the slab or when they come out of the mechanical yard, from that point on, we're controlling exactly how it gets from point A to point B. And that's the same for everything, right? And preempting that and making the conversation happen earlier rather than later is always beneficial.
For me, anything really.
Yeah, sure. For me, I think, when this project completed and I kind of looked back on it, and we kind of joke about this now, but I'd said, we are never doing another project with a pre-engineered system, period. It is just not worth it. And then, a year later, we found ourselves working on another winery that needed to leverage that system. And instead of pouting about it, we said, look, what did we learn from the last exercise? We learned a lot. And so we were armed with a little bit more information than we had before. We were prepared for some of those things. We could speak the speak. When we were talking, we made sure that we had more contact with the engineer that was on the other side of the line, that the contractor kind of keeps them away from you, the relationship. And it went a little smoother. And it'll, proof's in the pudding. It hasn't gone to permitting yet, but when it does, I'm confident that it'll be a lot of those little nuanced problems that we ran into will be kind of dissolved and we won't have them. There'll be some other surprises, I'm sure, but we gave ourselves as much help by going through that process and learning from it to, prepare ourselves to, get through the next one as best we could. But ultimately, we still prefer traditional structural steel that you can curate every connection in detail. And it's just kind of a collaboration with the structural engineer on, trying to keep things smaller that we always go through. But I would say that, that learning process is kind of the best hindsight that we had on this one. And time will tell how many more opportunities we have to work with something like that, and we'll.
It seems to me in that arena, it's becoming a thing. And what a shame it would have been for you to learn all those lessons and then not be able to apply them to the next one, especially because this is not the first building in a winery or brewery kind of setting that I've heard people using these pre-engineered buildings. And if it's going to be a thing, you're the experts now, right?
Yeah. You think, but
have you suffered enough to be an expert yet?
I don't know about that, but it comes down. There's nothing inherently wrong with the metal building system. It's learning the process for getting to an understanding of what it is before it's fabricated. Then it's just it's like an existing condition.
Right.
And you're working around it. And once you do that, then you know the rules of the game and you can sculpt in the way you see fit.
What a great way to look at it, as an existing condition. I love that.
Yeah.
What is the number one piece of advice you would give an architecture firm that wants to take on a winery project and they've never there'll be 1,000 pieces, but what would be like your first thing you would tell them? Hey, if you're going to take this on, you better.
Well, yeah, I'm going to say something in the I started working on Epic Winery, which was my very first one that started back in like 05. That particular client told me, hey, guess what? Your beer drinking days are over. You're now going to be a wine drinker. And I was like, okay, because I had, at that particular time in my life, I wasn't really that versed in what it meant to drink wine. And it's kind of something that's kind of grown with all these projects. But I think that that kind of point in my career opened me up to working on these types of facilities. And I think along the way, you get to know, like, not only the drinking of the wine, like we were talking about earlier, but how they make wine. And the process of making wine is pretty straightforward depending on which winery is making the wine, but they have all these little nuances of how they want to make wine, which are very particular to them. So I think knowing that process of how they want to make wine, not just how wine is made, it's really it's kind of like designing a house for someone. How do they want to live? Not how does this person live? And so really being specific to their process, their needs, their goals is step number one.
Yeah, I mean, I would just second the same sentiment, which is I'm going to paraphrase Juhani Palasma, who's a famous Finnish architect. He says something along the lines of get to know your clients so well that you become them, and then design for yourself. And so there's the sentiment in there is that if you know the specifically the wineries, if you know the process that they want to employ in their own winemaking, the decision making is so much clearer to you as to how the building needs to situate itself. And since the process is so integral to the way spaces are laid out on the site, or how they relate to one another, or where the infrastructure needs to go and how it's routed, that's such a primary focus of wineries that if you don't understand that, you're really off on the wrong foot. So
I love that. I happen to be Finnish.
Right.
You just quoted a Finnish architect, so I'm going to be looking him up. But I love that quote, and I love that mindset, because so many, most of my career has been in architecture, and so often the team will get lost in this focus on a new project of how is this done, and not how do you do it.
Right.
And these are crafts people. This is an art to them. There's never going to be two that do it the same way. And taking that mindset of figuring out how a winery works beyond that to figuring out how your winery is going to work is such valuable advice for anybody that wants to go jump into that pool. Because it could be a real disaster if you don't go in with that mindset. You think you've got it all figured out, and, maybe some people, a little bit of that architectural ego, I'm going to do this. And then they come in, that's so not going to work. for us and how we want to work. So that was a great answer. Before we get to our couple of closing questions, what's next for Clayton Korte, or what's going on? What do you have on the boards? I know nobody has boards anymore, but I still love to say that.
we still have boards.
What do we have to look forward to that I get to call you about later and say, okay, tell me about this one?
We have a bunch of cool stuff that's just on the verge of sharing, which is there's a couple of cool projects here in San Antonio at the historic Pearl, which I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's an old Pearl Brewery redevelopment here in San Antonio. It's created its own district, and we've got a former horse stable that's turned into a live music venue that's really cool. There's an old glass company building that we've kind of adaptive reused, and it's going to be this incredible market. There's all types of urban living around this complex, and the old brewery is this incredible hotel called Hotel Emma. There's that. There's a really cool coffee destination in Austin called Cosmic that is finished, and we're going to photograph, pretty soon. We've got a cool house in Santa Barbara, just north of Santa Barbara, that's on another vineyard overlooking most incredible scenery you can imagine, that is supposed to be done sometime June or July. All the way, a cool little concrete sauna here in the Texas Hill Country that's 100 square feet, but it's this really great little building on a ranch. So there's that.
And in Texas, you don't even need to heat it.
Yeah. Just open the door. And then on the board stuff, we are fortunate to work on kind of a real wide variety of typologies. We have a whole bunch of restaurant and bar projects going on, ranch houses. We have 2 other wineries that we have, one in permitting, one we're starting design, another tasting room here in the Texas Hill Country, a private kind of members club and kind of restaurant bar in Aspen. So there's all kinds of cool stuff we'd love to be able to kind of talk to you about at some point.
Well, and I don't know if you've ever had any repeat projects, but the tasting room for Fulldraw,
that's a good point. Yeah.
phase 2, the first repeat,
Well, and I thought about that, I would love to have you back when it's done to talk about, what did it fully end up being, and how all that process went. I've done a couple of interviews in the last couple of years where we talked about a phase 1 of something, whatever I interview people on all types of projects, and it was like, okay, or it wasn't built yet, and we just talked to it was just like just starting under construction. One that's notable to me that I'm going to make them come back whether they want to or not is that I'm going to draw a complete blank because I'm trying to think about it, but they're building this, rebuilding and adding onto this museum in California, the Space Museum, but they have the Endeavour, the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Oh, yeah. They have the actual space shuttle there. And because of the size of a space shuttle, they had to design the building around and build it around the space shuttle. And so it was just starting under construction when we had our interview. It's probably nearing, it was going to be a while before it was going to be done. I think it's next year it'll be completely done, but just fascinating. So I was like, you have to come back because I have to hear how, because all these special things they had to do to protect the space shuttle while they built around it. And so I would love to have you back to hear about that.
Sounds great.
Anything else you guys have? Because you guys are fun.
Yeah.
So everybody gets one broad industry question. If you had a crystal ball, tell me what you think architecture firms are going to look like 20 years from now.
Whoa.
Easy, light question.
I'm retired by this, and I'll have to think about it.
We've had these kinds of questions in our office, kind of some impromptu, some not so impromptu, mostly circulating around AI, which I don't think anyone really has a handle on. It used to be 1,000 years ago, you knew what it was going to be like in 50 or 100 years. Change didn't happen very rapidly, but today it'd almost be a mistake for us to answer what we think an architecture firm is going to be like in 20 years, because we'll be so wrong that in 20 years, somebody's going to play this podcast back and, ridicule us on how horrible we were at anticipating that. But my gut feeling is that artificial intelligence or automation to some extent is going to change the way we do things. I don't know how significantly, but the other thing I think is going to change quite a bit is our methods of fabrication. I don't think it'll be open to everyone, but we've worked with some fabrication partners out of British Columbia, who have just this incredible ability to do CNC routing for timber structures, and the sophistication of the fabrication is unbelievable. And I think it's certainly, at least on one of our projects, it's changed the way we deliver changed the way we deliver the building, and maybe some of the sensibilities we have in design. But I think there's a lot of room for growth and change in the fabrication world.
On the front side of that question, it makes me think that, currently students that are in architecture schools are just on the line of where this is all starting. And the educational process is going to transform as well at a different clip. I mean, you're already got classes that they don't even go in person anymore, and it's just all virtual, and you can pipe people in from all over the world into one course. It's really cool. And so as all this technology starts to inform, the construction world and how we deliver projects, how students come into firms and start to learn is also going to transform, and we're going to be the ones that have to adapt. It's not like we're going to train them how things used to be. It's going to be the other way around. So kind of exciting. It's a little unnerving too.
Nobody wants to be a dinosaur.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. I couldn't agree, but we have quite a few of them. I just think about how much I started in my first firm when I was 20 years old. That was 5 years ago, but
yeah.
I can try.
Yeah.
But I think about it, and my oldest son said this to me recently. He said, Mom, I'm the first generation that started my younger life where nobody had computers, and computers came to be a thing during my lifetime. But he was young enough that, he was raised on them. I remember our first computer in an office. I don't know how many times I've said this on the podcast. It was a Radio Shack Tandy computer. And you had to put this floppy disk in it. And, I just see how far we've come, but I do see it. Fabrication is changing at light speeds. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to change far faster than any of us think. But it is us that are still around and have some time to go left in our career that we're going to be the ones that have to adapt. They're growing into it, and they've been raised in a way to accommodate that change a lot more quickly than I think how some of us were raised.
Yeah. And it can be scary, but I think in terms of fabrication, advancements in fabrication actually benefit us.
Yeah.
They don't take away from the creativity that we have. I see it as an overall benefit.
Well, and there's some really good things happening. I've had a couple of guests that are doing some really great things with these, prefabricating a house in areas where people don't have much. And they can have a home. There's this one family that has been living in a shipping container, a 1980s Cold War shipping container that now has a home.
Yeah.
With even 2 floors. And they did it for pennies on the dollar of anything we would. I think everything altogether was something like $10,000 or $15,000 for a 2-story house because of what they could prefabricate and ship out there and then teach the people in that area to put it together. And then they, had obviously some construction to do, sheetrocking and things like that. But I think it'll be just a game changer globally in bringing everybody up.
Yeah.
So, it'll be interesting. Final question. Everybody gets this one. So there's no escaping. You can't run. We all hope, I hope we all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. So for the two of you, personal or professional, can be either way. It doesn't have to have anything to do with architecture. What do you hope your impact will be? How do you hope to make a difference? Whether it's on the whole world or one person that ripples out to the whole world.
On the personal side, it's pretty simple. I hope that looking back that I was, a good son and good sibling and friend and husband and father and mentor and all that, just to make sure I've left an impression on those who I was surrounded by and loved. And, along the way, I hope I made them laugh, enough to keep things fresh. On the professional side, hopefully in what we do, we work a lot. And so hopefully I've impacted people's lives, whether it's, to have them live a more fulfilling life in their house or create a facility where they can make, world-class wine. And along the way, hopefully those structures have improved the natural environment versus kind of taken away from it.
Well, you made me laugh today. With your email, I don't think I've ever seen anybody ride a Longhorn before.
Yeah.
Go figure. Cam?
Yeah. I think my answer, from a professional point of view, I think it's to, hopefully leave a more beautiful impact. And this seems a little cheesy, but, to make sure that when things get built, that they're built more beautifully than if I weren't here. I don't know if I always meet that expectation, but that I think is, and there's some stewardship, I think, of especially natural landscapes, but there's stewardship involved in that, which is to say that we get to work in some pretty fantastic areas, and the first thing that pops in your head when you go visit one of these sites is like, man, don't screw this up. It's already beautiful. How do we only improve on it? And so there's that ambition, I think, is something that drives me to do what I do.
There's absolutely nothing cheesy about standing behind something you feel strongly about. I don't care what it is. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a landscape destroyed by an ugly building or somebody who didn't take at all the surrounding area into consideration. So I think that is a noble cause. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. It's been my honor to have you here today, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. We had a lot of fun, and would love to come back again, and we're big fans, so we'll keep watching too.
Well, I know where to find you now. There's no escaping.
Yeah.
You're stuck. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.